Welcome to Libyth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in Edo period Japan with the Bushido Shoshinshu, the code of the samurai. Today we close the week with the ideas, the themes underneath the text, and what they leave us with. We've read the Bushido Shoshinshu, looked at how its argument is structured, and spent time with the figures who inhabit it and stand behind it. Today, I want to go to the deepest layer, the ideas. What does this text actually believe about how people should live within institutions? And where do its beliefs reveal something more than their stated purpose? Let me begin with a question the text itself does not ask, but that its content makes unavoidable. What is honor, actually? Not what honor feels like from the inside, the warm sense of having acted in accordance with one's values, but what it does from the outside, what function it performs in the social system that Shigesuke is describing. If you listen to the language that the older book uses, you hear the same point in different words. Honor there appears as na, menmoku, guaibun, a good name, a face in public, what people hear of you, and it is treated not as a private sentiment, but as a kind of credit. The samurai's word, the bushi no ikaigan, carries weight. A promise is often kept without a written pledge because the social ledger enforces it. Promissory notes even carry clauses that surrender a man's public esteem as security. Call me a fool if I fail, because reputation is the currency that buys patronage, trust, and office. A samurai with honor has credit. A samurai who loses it finds the market closed. This is the practical anatomy of honor in the world Shigesuke moves through. Honor is social currency, and this makes it at once a moral claim and an instrument of survival. That duality, moral claim and instrument, is crucial, because it explains why the Bushido Shoshinshu will preach virtue with the language of prudence. Honor is not the opposite of self-interest. It is the most durable form of self-interest available inside the samurai social order. That makes the book both candid and useful. Candid about what institutions demand, useful because it reveals how moral vocabularies can be engineered to stabilize social life. Yet the same candidness carries a risk, which the book itself occasionally admits. When reputation and virtue drift apart, the system has few tools to reconcile them. That tension between virtue and reputation is the first thing to follow carefully, because the way Shigesuke handles it is more subtle than a surface reading suggests. You can picture two distinct failures the book is anxious to prevent. One is appearance without reality, a man who stages virtue to win favor. The other is reality without appearance, a man whose good character goes unnoticed and therefore unrewarded. Shigesuke doesn't collapse virtue into reputation. He insists on makoto, sincerity, as the hinge that must bind inner and outer. Makoto in the sources behind Bushido is not mere honesty, but the congruence of heart and habit, the absence of theatrical distance between what you are and what you show. It is the same idea Tsutsu elevates when he says sincerity is the beginning and end of all things. It is the Wan Yang Ming insistence that conscience lights the way. For the samurai, sincerity is moral and instrumental. Morally required because deception is a moral breach. Instrumentally required because a performance without substance will be exposed, and the exposure will be ruinous. To see why the code insists on this alignment, look at the ritual and pedagogical apparatus the samurai have built. Boys are girded with a sword at 5. The sword is a constant public sign. You grow up in a culture where your name and your face are under continuous audit, where politeness, punctuality, And the way you settle debts are not private preferences, but indicators on the social scoreboard. So the code teaches both inward formation, rectitude, benevolence, courage, and outward legibility. What to wear, how to speak, what to pay, and when. That double education is how the system keeps the ledger balanced. But it presumes the two columns will stay parallel. When they don't, the code is strained, and the book shows us again and again how painful the strain becomes. The samurai who takes up commerce after the feudal system collapses, we are told, discovers the mismatch. The virtues that keep a man honorable in court and camp don't translate easily into the market, where a different set of incentives and sanctions govern honesty. The result is reputational bankruptcy that was not predicted by the old vocabulary of honor. The code expected sincerity to be both visible and true. When the world of incentives shifts, that expectation can fail. And the book doesn't paper over that failure, it exposes it. Which brings us to the second theme, the code as a technology of group cohesion. The way Bushido manufactures a class that can be trusted without constant external policing. Shigesuke writes as if he has seen the efficiency gains produced when behavior is made predictable. A class in which everyone internalizes the same rules polices itself. A lord need not watch every retainer if every retainer watches the others. The tea room, the elaborate etiquette of Ogasawara, the tiny rituals of politeness about hats and parasols, they are not trivialities, the book insists. They are norm specification. The tea ceremony is more than aesthetic pastime. Chan-Oyu disciplines the nerves, teaches silence, trains the body to graceful economy of motion, and therefore makes people legible to one another. Politeness isn't merely agreeable garnish. It is a social technology that creates mutual intelligibility and prefigures sanction. The Ogasawara maxim, the end of etiquette is to cultivate the mind so that not the roughest ruffian will dare attack you, is instructive. The ritual produces a comportment that commands deference and so reduces conflict. If you let that thought run, you see corporate culture in perfect historical echo. When an organization publishes values, it is doing exactly what the samurai schools did. Specifying expectations, signaling what is rewarded, and outsourcing enforcement to peer pressure. What makes a code like Bushido effective is that moral vocabulary and social function coincide. That coincidence is powerful. It also concentrates authority in the hands of the group. It makes reputation the lever that moves careers and lives. And when reputational leverage becomes the main currency, people learn to manage their appearance with a seriousness that looks very much like moral duty. Which brings us, inevitably, to the third theme, reputation management as a moral practice, not vanity, not mere branding, but responsibility. Shigesuke is unsparing about the labor that goes into keeping a good name. Reputation does not follow automatically from virtue. The samurai must make virtue visible without turning it into a hollow show. The book's practical advice, dress properly for rank, settle debts on time, avoid compromising associations, looks like personal branding because it is. But the advice is shot through with an ethic. Appearance that is not grounded in reality is a kind of lie. That was the social pedagogy of Makoto. Keep your outer acts consonant with inner states, and if you fail, atone in a way that makes the truth visible. The public ceremonies of atonement in the book show how literal this was. Think of seppuku, of the rite rendered by Mitford's eyewitness account. A man enters the temple, lays the wakizashi before himself, declares his fault aloud, reveals his belly, the seat of soul in the idiom of the age, and disembowels himself. The kaishaku, the friend and second, finishes the act with a single stroke. The ritual is painstakingly public, juridical, even theatrical, because what it does is convert a private moral state into public evidence. It says to the community, "See the inner truth now made manifest, mark the restoration or the judgment." The ceremony is horrifying and precise for the same reason. It must erase ambiguity. The social ledger is reconciled through a visible transaction, blood for credit. That is reputation as sacrament. There are gentler instances of the same logic. Kenshin sending salt to Shinjin when his enemy was being deprived of it, not because politics demanded it, but because honor and the proper way to wage war required magnanimity. Or the story of Oda Dakin, pierced with a spear and yet exchanging couplets with his assailant. Composure in crisis is proof, again, of inner steadiness that must be legible to others. The samurai life lives by making virtue readable. The skillful management of appearance is moral work. It builds trust that institutions depend on. If reputation is a moral practice, then the fourth theme follows with a disquieting symmetry. Moral codes are also branding tools, and that identification makes them both efficient and brittle. Bushido is genuinely an ethical system. It draws on Zen stoicism, on Shinto loyalty, on Confucian relations, on Wan Yang Ming's insistence that knowing and acting are one. It proposes sharp virtues: rectitude, courage, benevolence, politeness, veracity. Those virtues cultivate character. At the same time, they were exactly the behaviors that made a samurai reliable inside a feudal polity: prudent in judgment, steady in crisis, deferential in the right places. In other words, the virtues doubled as functional specifications for a class that must hold power. The danger is visible when those two domains, moral good and social utility, lose their overlap. The book gives us two kinds of fractures. One is institutional. When the social environment changes, the behaviors that used to translate moral worth into social credit no longer do. That's the Meiji merchant story. Samurai suddenly dispossessed of fiefs, obliged to sell bonds, told that they could invest in commerce. They discover that the market rewards a different set of habits. A gentleman's disdain for the abacus does not become a profitable strategy in a capitalist exchange. The samurai who kept his honor intact can lose his economic footing, and the samurai who learns market tricks can lose social esteem. The code offers no arbitration for that divergence. The second fracture is moral conflict within the old frame. When telling the truth to one's lord would cost you your position, what then? Shigemori's agony over loyalty to sovereign versus filial duty shows us the problem. The code sits uneasily because its highest loyalty is to the lord and the class. And when those claims contradict the moral sense, the book's practical remedies, remonstrate gently, show sincerity, can be tragically inadequate. The code presumes alignment between what is right and what keeps you standing in the social ledger. It has few resources for principled disobedience. That lack is not a failure of rhetoric so much as a structural blind spot. It is the place where the system needs supplementation, other moral languages, other institutions that can stand in when class habits and individual conscience diverge. There is one last insight the Shoshinshu presses on us more insistently than most modern readers expect: the connection between frugality and freedom. The book treats money with near ascetic distaste, The samurai were trained to think in contemptuous terms about filthy lucre. But that disdain sits beside a persistent insistence on thrift as a moral condition of independence. Debt is a kind of servitude. A man in debt cannot speak freely to his lord, cannot risk honest counsel without jeopardy. Frugality is not mere thrift. It is the structural precondition of autonomy. The samurai who keeps his household under control retains the freedom to act honestly, to remonstrate, to risk standing for a cause. When the code says, "Grudge money less than all things," what it really wants is to protect the capacity for independent judgment. You can hear the same argument in contemporary terms. The person with enough savings to weather 3 months of unemployment has a different relationship to ethical choices than the person who lives hand to mouth. Financial margin creates moral margin. The old book makes this vivid through examples: the scorn for ostentation, the training that produces contempt for money's glamour, and the strict admonitions against extravagant living. That same training produces men who can stand their ground. It is a small, practical lesson from an antique ethic that still works in modern offices and professions. But even this insight carries the same caveat we keep returning to. The remedy is internal to the code's logic. Frugality protects independence within the samurai world. It does not tell you what to do when that independence is used in service of an unjust power. The code gives you the means of autonomy. It does not settle the ends. You have to bring that judgment from somewhere else. So, what do we carry away from the Bushido Shoshinshu? Carry this: honor, reputation, and the management of one's institutional persona are not separate from moral practice in this tradition. To attend to how you appear to others, to make your outer acts the faithful translation of your inner judgments, is a form of responsibility, not merely image management. Carry also the practical corollary. The gap between appearance and reality is not just a moral failing. It is an existential liability, because exposure ruins credit more decisively than any private failing. And carry the cautions too. A code that weaponizes honor as social currency will be efficient at producing predictable behavior, but it will be brittle where social circumstances change or where the claims of conscience and reputation collide. The Bushido Shoshinshu assumes alignment. History shows us alignment can crack. When it does, the code has few internal remedies. You must borrow resources from other moral languages: law, universal human rights, perhaps a religion that places conscience above class, if you want a principled way to navigate divergence. The old book is honest about its own limits. It knows how to cultivate courage, rectitude, politeness, benevolence. It knows how to craft self-discipline through ritual like Chan-O-Yu, how to make sincerity visible through the most extreme rites, how to bind a class together through shared standards. It is less fluent when asked to adjudicate conflicts that place loyalty and conscience at odds. That omission is as telling as any precept. It is the place where history forces the code to be supplemented, not simply repeated. Finally, remember something the book insists upon in its own voice. The samurai's spirit is hardy. The sakura, the cherry blossom, is the image the author loves. Beautiful, brief, and fragrant, the tree's blossom drops, but its scent lingers. Bushido may lose its institutional anchors. Feudalism may be gone, swords may be outlawed, merchants may change the incentives. Yet the dispositions the code cultivated, the habit of honor, resilience, and attention to how character shows in action, do not vanish overnight. Scratch a modern reformer of Meiji-era Japan, and you'll find a samurai underneath. The code's light, even if diminished, continues to shape choices, to make some options visible and others unthinkable. So take from Shigesuke what is enduring, the insistence on sincerity, the link between self-discipline and social trust, the practical wisdom about frugality and independence, and bring to it what it lacks. A principled account of what to prioritize when conscience and reputation diverge. That is the honest way to reckon with a text that is at once a handbook for living in an institution and a remarkably lucid mirror of how institutions actually work. That's all for today on Libyth. Next Monday, we begin a new book. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week. At least we try.